sensational revelation. The so-called peace plan was prepared by Kremlin agents in Trump's entourage. Conversations between Putin's aide and Trump were leaked online, suggesting they were secretly trying to negotiate behind the American president's back, Witkoff to Moscow and the US Army General to Kyiv. There are 2 days left before the attempt to conclude a peace agreement, and Ukraine will receive $5 billion worth of weapons from NATO countries. We'll talk about this right now. So friends, welcome to the Razborka project with Sergei Zhirnov, an expert in international relations and intelligence services, former senior officer of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service of the USSR and Russia. Glad to see you, Sergei. Hello.
Hello, Alexander. I'm very glad as well. Hello to all our viewers.
Sergei, over the past few days, everyone has been talking about peace, and I think that's very dangerous because it seems like there's no sign of peace coming from Russia. I want to hear your opinion on the current situation. This plan, which in fact no one has seen in full, and as I understand it, no one has really studied. The story is as follows. Yermak has now said that Zelensky is ready to hold talks with Trump in the next 2 days in order to finalize this peace agreement, among other things. Peskov says that it's too early to talk about any discussions regarding a return to peace agreements. What do you think about this? Because it feels like Trump wants to do something flashy and PR-driven again, but the truth is Putin hasn't been informed about it. And we perfectly understand that until either Putin is removed or there is a real agreement, the war will not end. What do you think? Will there be peace?
Well, you've described the situation absolutely correctly. The situation is actually really difficult to understand, but at the same time, it's as simple as any plain truth. You're absolutely right. That's my point of view as well. And on this, we are 100% in agreement. As long as Putin is alive, there will be no peace. And all of this, all these negotiations, all these peace plans, for Putin, it's either a trick for Trump or the only peace plan Putin is willing to accept is Ukraine's capitulation. And by the way, it was written a long time ago. It was written back in 1922. When basically Ukraine gives up everything, agrees to everything, everyone recognizes the seizure of Ukrainian territories and so on and so forth. In other words, Ukraine becomes a satellite of the Russian Federation, much like Belarus is now. Ukraine would essentially become like Belarus, but even worse, because Lukashenko can afford to criticize Putin, to troll him, to use sarcasm and even mock Putin live on air, for example, when he says, so they call us dictators, us? Well, of course, we're dictators. You have to say things like that to Putin, who puffs up his cheeks and so on. This plan, of course, was a very bad thing over the past week. It was a kind of forceful attempt, which, as you can understand, and now we already know, I mean, we already suspected as much because cynical and seasoned people always sense what's really going on. But now we even have proof that, in fact, there is a team around Trump that works directly for Putin. And not just working for Putin, but working against the United States of America. That is when Witkoff calls Dmitriev or Ushakov and tells them from the American side that they need to do this, that, and the other so that their plan goes through with Trump. That's working for Moscow. In principle, in diplomacy, people get fired for this and representatives get executed for it. And so on. In other words, this is working for the opposing side. That is advising the opposing side on how to more easily push through what that side wants. By the way, I really like the expression opposing side because it's opposing in every sense of the word. It's opposing because it's on the other side of the barricades, and it's opposing because it's disgusting. This was an attempt at just such a betrayal and an attempt to push through yet another capitulation plan because Trump, by the way, didn't read it. You understand yourself, a person who can't read 3 lines can't make it to point 28. He can't even get to the second point. He gets stuck on the 3 lines of the first point, and then he says, don't tell me anything here. So basically, you told me everything is fine, okay? Launch this whole mess. Let the Ukrainians respond to it within a week. And the problem for Ukraine was not to fall out completely with Trump because a lot still depends on him. And this is a very serious problem. That's why, by the way, if you noticed, for our viewers, I mean, I'm saying, if you watched or listened, you might have noticed a certain statement that might seem strange from Yermak and Zelensky, where they said about Trump, yes, the Trump plan. They said, yes, the Trump plan. It's such a good plan. We can work with it. It could serve as a good framework agreement. all of this is just ritual dancing. That is, with Trump, you can never say that something he proposed is bad, even if it's obvious to everyone. It's like the story of the emperor's new clothes. The emperor's new clothes, so to speak. The king is naked, but we all have to tell him that, so to speak, he's dressed. Because in the fairy tale, the moral is a bit different because we're such cynics and so afraid of losing our positions that if the king says he's dressed and we see that he's naked, we'll still say he's dressed. Here it's a bit different because we're simply dependent on Trump, although in principle the morale is about the same as in the fairy tale, since those were officials who depended on the king, so they went along with him. But in principle, this attempt was brazen, which was explained by two things. The first thing is that last week there was, let's say, a major public corruption scandal in Ukraine, and all of Ukraine's enemies believed that this seriously weakened Zelensky, and that this was the moment and the opportunity to put pressure on him and force him to capitulate. They actually don't understand how Ukraine works. They don't understand that Zelensky doesn't actually decide anything in Ukraine. In other words, Zelensky can't just bring them a plan, because as soon as he does, the Verkhovna Rada will immediately remove him from office. And if they don't do that, then there will be a Maidan in Kiev. 1 million Kiev residents will take to the streets. Ukrainians from all over the country will come and say, we don't need a president like that. And in this regard, they don't understand that Zelensky can't push anything through. Putin can push things through in his own country, and Trump, although even Trump, by the way, can't really push anything through either. And we'll get back to that. Back to this plan. That's the first point. Second, thank God we have Marco Rubio. Here's Marco Rubio, a true statesman, a real Republican who sees himself as better than the President of the United States. He doesn't want to get completely dirty in this mess, although he's already somewhat tainted by being Secretary of State under Trump. But nevertheless, he doesn't want to go for outright capitulation, to lay down arms, or to betray America's interests. That's why he once again helped Ukraine. By the way, before that, he thwarted an attempt by Putin and Trump to meet in Budapest. That's also to Marco Rubio's credit. In this sense, he's a serious player, one whom, by the way, both Trump and J.D. Vance are afraid of. Because Marco Rubio, strictly speaking, is a contender for the next presidential post against J.D. Vance. And here, both of them are, so to speak, going all in. Because for both, this will be the decisive battle after Trump either dies, is almost impeached and leaves, or simply finishes his term ingloriously and fades into the oblivion of history. So that's the complicated story we have. And for Ukraine, of course, it was important not to accept this plan, and at the same time not to completely fall out with Trump. Well, that's why, by the way, Zelensky said he was ready. Yermak said that Zelensky was ready to sign this plan within 2 days, because they know that yesterday Trump pardoned the Turkey and went off to Mar-a-Lago to play golf. When Trump goes off to Mar-a-Lago to play golf, you can offer him anything you want. He's not going anywhere, because golf is more important to him than America's interests, than the interests of the world, and so on. Zelensky can offer him anything he wants this week. He knows that's it. Trump has already flown off to Australia. He's already eating that turkey, maybe even the same one he pardoned, by the way. He's eating it with his family, with Witkoff, with his close associates at Mar-a-Lago, playing golf with them. And that's it. He doesn't care anymore about Ukraine, Europe, or the world. It doesn't concern him anymore.
Sergey, here's what I want to ask you. So, following the results of this meeting in Geneva, right? Yesterday, Trump put out a post saying that everything is great, everything is wonderful. The war, which would never have started if he were in charge, he will end it. And now, in the near future, he expects that Steve Witkoff will meet with Putin and Dan Driscoll will meet with Zelensky, a person who, in my opinion, is not really involved in what's happening in Ukraine, yet for some reason he's now taking an active role, apparently after Keith Kellogg was sidelined. The configuration is changing a bit. Let me remind our audience, this is Dan Driscoll, the US Secretary of the Army. So Trump says that over the past week, the team has achieved tremendous success and is eagerly anticipating this meeting. Moreover, he wants to meet with both Putin and Zelensky, but only after the ceasefire agreement is finalized or in its final stages. Tell me, does Trump really believe that this agreement can bring peace? Or is this, once again, just his attempt to play the role of the main peacemaker, as he tried to explain before, saying there would be some kind of peace committee that he would lead, and then the war wouldn't start? So, what do you think his real intentions are?
Trump is a patient for psychiatrists. And that's why it's very hard to say what's going on in his head, because he's a true mentally ill sociopath. Just listen to how he brings up Biden every day, even though he already defeated him and has been in the White House for 10 months, holding full power. Yet he keeps repeating it all like a mantra every day. Biden, 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 Biden. This is psychiatry. And that's why it's very difficult to predict what's going on in his head, what he wants, what he doesn't want. It seems he sincerely wants this war, this problem to simply end. But it's the sincerity of an idiot, an average person who, like an ostrich, thinks that if he buries his head in the sand and doesn't see something, then the problem doesn't exist. In other words, he just doesn't want to get rid of this problem. He absolutely doesn't care how it's done. That is, he absolutely doesn't want to achieve some kind of just peace for Ukraine. He doesn't want to punish the aggressor. He just wants it to be over and never happen again. He wants to wake up one day and suddenly hear that no one is shooting in Ukraine anymore, that everything is peaceful, that the armies have been pulled back. And now we can trade with Russia and build Trump towers in every city of the 80 federal subjects of Russia, however many there are with a few extra, and basically carve up Russia completely instead of handing it over to China. And there's nothing else to it. In other words, Trump absolutely doesn't care about international law, about the Charter, about the Vienna Convention of 1969, which states that any international treaty concluded under threat or use of force is not valid from the standpoint of international law. Trump couldn't care less about all of that. He tried to make this attempt. Moreover, he didn't do it himself. There was this Witkoff and various delegations going back and forth. When he realized that this plan wouldn't work and nothing could be signed, he backed out in the way you described. But I'll explain to you exactly how he backed out. Now he said, yes, we've made progress, everything is good, everything is wonderful, but now, so to speak, they need to come to an agreement among themselves, and when they finally reach an agreement among themselves and have their own plan ready, then I'll meet with them and try to get my Nobel Peace Prize for signing that plan. It's clear that this plan won't appear in the coming hours, days, weeks, or even months, because Putin doesn't need this plan. Putin wants Ukraine to surrender. Ukraine will not agree to surrender. Putin has already been told many times that they categorically reject the European plan, and that plan is real. It's a proper one. Even Trump's shortened 19-point plan doesn't satisfy them. They want Trump's original plan, in other words, Putin's plan, because the original 28-point plan is Putin's plan, which was written in Russian. We have now obtained proof of this matter. It was analyzed by artificial intelligence, which told us that this text was written in Russian and then translated into English using Google Translate into poor English, which is why it contains Russian turns of phrase that are unfamiliar to the English ear and grammar and to American English. So everything is clear here, and the attempt failed. So Trump left, pardoned a Turkey, ignored Ukraine, and went off to play golf.
Nevertheless, Steve Witkoff will still meet with Putin. What kind of scheme will Putin propose to Witkoff this time? I mean, to Witkoff, who is supposed to report it back to Trump? How do you see him trying to continue this game if he can't directly say, no, I want the war to go on? Putin won't say that.
There won't be anything new here. And most importantly for us, to give our viewers at least some positive news, nothing will get worse here. Because everything bad that Putin wanted to get from Trump, he has already told Witkoff. So in this sense, he won't be able to get anything new from Witkoff because they've already presented Witkoff with their maximum program. It's already in his head. He voiced it in his interview with Tucker Carlson. In other words, he's already swallowed all the Kremlin narratives and is working as a mouthpiece for the Kremlin anyway. I don't think we should expect anything worse from this meeting than what we've already seen. This is all very bad because in general, just so our viewers understand, if you ever hear the name Witkoff anywhere, you should know that it means Putin. That's all there is to it, and that it's a bad thing. Nothing good will ever come from Witkoff, no matter where he is or what he does. He ruined the negotiations with Hamas. He supposedly reached an agreement, but in reality, everything fell apart. He tried to negotiate with Iran, but nothing worked out. He tried to negotiate with Putin, but in reality, he wasn't negotiating with Putin at all. He was just accepting everything that Putin, I immediately picture those baby birds, chicks with their beaks wide open, and the mother bird flies in. So a worm and they just swallow it whole without chewing, and it all ends up inside them. That's exactly how Witkoff swallows everything from Putin. And on the other hand, thank God, he doesn't actually decide anything. That is, he swallows any propaganda or wishes from Putin and then relays them to Trump. That's it. He doesn't actually do anything else. In other words, he's a person who doesn't make decisions. In the sense that he doesn't make decisions. But the problem is that he talks to Trump and he has almost unlimited access to him. He can call Trump at any time. He plays golf with him. So that's the problem. This person who works directly for the Russian Federation is in Trump's inner circle and communicates with him daily, constantly, all the time.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
That's the problem.
Yes, and what's also interesting here is that Ushakov, among other things, confirmed to the propagandist Zarubin that Russia has not discussed the American plan for Ukraine, which was received through unofficial channels, with anyone. And also that at the negotiations between Russia and the US in Abu Dhabi, by the way, the Ukrainian delegation was headed by Kyrilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, the peace plan was also not discussed. Honestly, at this point, I don't even understand what's going on anymore. It seems like there were negotiations, but Why do you think, Sergei, that they are now so adamantly saying, no, the plan doesn't even exist, it wasn't discussed with us? Why aren't they playing along with Trump so openly? What is this tool really about?
Exactly. Because among them, there are actually some people who aren't that stupid. Ushakov is not a fool. He's a Soviet type, but he's not a fool. That is, he's smarter than, for example, Lavrov. He's a real foreign minister. He is genuinely building this idiotic policy together with Putin. But still, that's what it is. It's idiotic in the sense that it's Soviet, it's imperial. With the negotiations that took place in Abu Dhabi, everything is actually very simple. These were negotiations that had been planned from the start. They had nothing to do with this plan. The heads of intelligence from both countries met there. And the discussion there, which is ongoing between these intelligence agencies, was about prisoner exchanges. In other words, this is the main negotiation, the exchange of prisoners and the exchange of the bodies of the dead. That's why Budanov went to Abu Dhabi. But it just so happened that this technical negotiation process overlapped with the big politics surrounding the peace plan, and everything got mixed together. And so this Driscoll flew in there. He tried to sort out something political. In reality, no one had the authority to resolve anything political. Secondly, he wasn't prepared to resolve or sort them out. And that's why this kind of layering happened. But on the other hand, these negotiations are necessary. They are ongoing all the time. They take place either in Turkey, the Emirates, or Saudi Arabia. And this mainly concerns the exchange of prisoners and the exchange of bodies.
And what do you think is the purpose of leaking the conversations between Ushakov and Witkoff? He even had to justify himself for this recently. Let me remind our audience that he says, I often talk to Witkoff, Lavrov's aide, yes, Ushakov. As for the content of the conversations, he actually says that these are quite real transcripts that are being published. And he says, yes, all of this is being done to worsen relations with the US. And he says, well, they're definitely listening in on us, but it's not us doing it. What do you think? Could American intelligence agencies really be leaking these conversations? Who benefits from this?
It benefits us. It benefits us. It benefits Ukraine. It benefits Western Europe. It benefits all normal people. Thank God this exists. It's a sign that not everything in America is decided by the Trumpists and not everything is decided by Witkoff, who is ready to sell everything off at auction. In other words, it's an attempt to discredit Witkoff. It's an attempt to discredit these behind-the-scenes negotiations. It's pretty much the same as people who watched 17 Moments of Spring will remember. When there were behind-the-scenes negotiations with the Americans, with Himmler and Bormann wanted to disrupt them. So this is from the same category. In other words, these are people who basically understand that Witkoff is a very dangerous Putin agent of influence within the American establishment, and they are trying to neutralize him. That's why they were leaking stories that he might be dismissed by the end of this year. They're spreading stories that everything has actually fallen apart for Witkoff, that he's corrupt, and so on. This is exactly what we need. This is the right narrative. By the way, it's not made up. In fact, it's all true. But as you've seen, for some reason, this doesn't seem to be a problem for Trump at all. I mean, he was asked directly, your person is basically working for the Kremlin. She's just working against her own delegation. In other words, she's telling them how to manipulate you more quickly and effectively. And she's telling this to the enemies, to the other side. In fact, for this kind of insight and for working for the other side, in respectable circles, you'd be kicked out. And under Stalin, you'd be shot. But Trump said, well, that's just how we do things, so it's all fine, everything's okay. Apparently over there in New York, among real estate dealers in the world of realty business, that's just how things are. Everyone betrays each other. Everyone sells each other secrets. And for Trump, none of this is compromising as long as Witkoff himself tells him about it. By the way, Putin has a pretty similar story. In other words, if you leak something to someone, but then tell Putin about what you leaked and that it was in his interest, he won't have you shot. He won't put you in prison either.
I was saying there that Ushakov is, after all, Putin's aide, not Lavrov's. I wanted to say, well, yes, and here in these transcripts, there's a direct discussion about how to talk to Trump, and importantly, the recommendation was to make the visit before Zelensky's visit. That was Witkoff's recommendation. Okay, Sergei, let's wrap up. But I want to ask you about Europe's assistance at this moment, because it's very important to understand not just Europe, but NATO countries as well. We're talking about $5 billion, which Ukraine is supposed to receive in weapons in the near future. This concerns the Pearl system. This was stated by Secretary General Mark Rutte. As you can see, this scheme, again, so as not to distance themselves from the United States even on this issue, will continue. Trump sells weapons to NATO, NATO transfers weapons to Ukraine, and America profits. There are some strange attempts at negotiations going on. Will this scheme keep working further?
Yes, this scheme will continue to distract our attention. We will keep discussing this scheme. But really, as long as Trump is in power, as long as Trump doesn't do anything reasonable, and Putin isn't planning to end the war, that's why we'll keep going in circles. Just like we've been going in circles all this year. We've been going in circles. First it was Budapest, then it was Ankara, then there were some phone calls, then there was something else, and all of this is interspersed with attempts to play it all back. President Zelensky met in the United Nations format at the Vatican, and so on, attempts to turn things in a positive direction. Yes, unfortunately, we're just going to keep going in circles around this problem. Thank you
so much. Sergei Zhirnov, an expert in international relations and intelligence services, was on the air for the Razborka project. Thank you, Sergei. All the best.